Good, we got 5 minutes. Okay. All right. He's the most important. So important. Good. Rock and roll. So we got 2 minutes. 2 minutes. You did it all? Okay. Oh, good. Carry around a microphone after a bit. Yeah, I figured that. And I see it straight up for.
So Ivy, we're going to turn it to you after Kevin gets done. Is that right? Or are you going to start this off? Okay. She'll start and then say the governor's going to talk. Okay, I got it. Which one of us? He'll just hand it to me when he's done. Okay.
Yep.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for showing up today. Your presence here really shows how much this issue matters to you, and we're glad that you took the time to come out and share your thoughts and concerns. This town hall was asked for by Governor Gordon because he wanted to hear directly from you regarding the concerns that you have, as well as the thoughts that you have on solutions. So we are here today at Governor Gordon's request. So I just want to go over a little bit of how we're going to proceed. I'm going to hand the mic over to Governor Gordon here, and he's going to offer some opening remarks. And then Director Nesvik from Game and Fish has a very brief presentation to share with you. And then we'll hear some information as well from Dr. Kevin Monteith from the UW Hobbs School of Environment and Natural Resources. When we are ready to start for the public comment, because we have both a lot of folks here in the audience as well as folks online, we're going to just take 2 or 3 comments from the people here in the audience, and then we'll switch over to those who are on the virtual side as well. And that way, hopefully we'll be able to hear from everyone. We're going to ask that since we do have so many people here, that you limit your comment or your questions to 2 minutes. And if someone before you has asked the same question or has offered the same comment, if you would be so kind as to let someone else have the opportunity to ask a comment, a question, or offer a comment that might have something different. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Governor Gordon.
All right. Well, thanks very much for being here. You know, I grew up in KC over in Johnson County, and I have to say the whole time I was growing up, we had some bad winters, but we could always look to Pinedale and say, we know that's the North Pole. So welcome to the North Pole. And, you know, I don't want to make light of it. The fact of the matter is, you all know that we've seen tremendous losses in wildlife. This winter, it's been the toughest winter in a very long time. And I think it's particularly difficult because we've had several years now where winters have not been that tough. I know it's always a little bit below zero up here. That's why we always said this was the North Pole. But you know, this winter really has been devastating, and we've seen it in wildlife all over the southwestern part of the state. You'll hear a little bit from the Game and Fish Director Nesvik. Brian talked a little bit about what we're seeing some other places, but most importantly, and that's why I'm so glad that you're here, we want to hear from you thoughts about things that we should look at, things that we should be considering, And if you have some thoughts, please feel free to express them. I will say that we've got people online. So I know there's people in Star Valley that are listening, people in Cheyenne and other places. So if you can take the time to come up and be on a microphone, that will help them on Zoom so they can hear your comments. And I think importantly, the question that then is answered, if we can answer it for you. Again, thank you very much. And it really is, I think, a hallmark of Sublette County that this is where all of these nexus come together. This is where we have some of the best energy development in the country. We have companies that care about wildlife. We have companies that care about what goes on in the ecology here. We have people who've moved here because they love the wildlife. They care about what Wyoming has to offer. And we have a state government that frankly is very concerned about leading in all these kinds of crises. We don't need to have a Washington, D.C. kind of moment. What we need to do is have people come together, as we are right now, talking about what are the things we can do on the ground in place that make the most sense. So thanks again for being here, and I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Governor, and thanks all of you again for being here. This is certainly a reflection of the value that Sublette County and those of you that came from other places, not just here in Sublette County, have for our state's wildlife. I mean, as the governor said, we've been watching this situation probably starting in about early January on a statewide level. And what I wanted to do here today is to talk through kind of a quick summary of what the current conditions are and what we know about mortality, mainly with big game, from basically Pinedale, Jackson, Star Valley, southwest part of the state, and then over to Baggs. That's kind of the area that we're going to focus on here today. And that's been the parts of the state that have suffered the most significant winter conditions. So I'm going to start with Pinedale. The local field personnel here started observing mortality, lower amounts than what we're seeing now, but mortality in the early part of February to the mid part of February, probably around February 15th. And it wasn't long after they started seeing some dead antelope that they started seeing some dead antelope that looked fairly healthy. And we discovered that there was a strain of pneumonia that it was an outbreak here in Sublette County, and that hundreds of pronghorn were dying from this Mycoplasma bovi. We've now observed and tested animals from here all the way down to just north of Rock Springs that have tested positive. It seems like it's much more prevalent here in just south of Pinedale in Sublette County, but it has ranged that far. And certainly with what we see in other species with pneumonia, any kind of pneumonia, is it's much more exacerbated when you have difficult winter conditions. Certainly the winter conditions have persisted longer, and we heard some information earlier where, here in Pinedale, the average number of days below zero, the 30-year average of number of days below zero is, I think it was 32. Is that right, Brandon? 39. And this year there's been 62. You couple that with heavy snow loads and not a lot of country that's blown off, and it's ripe for a heck of a winter. What we've seen basically from Pinedale to Rock Springs is about 50% adult mortality on pronghorn and about 30% adult mortality on deer, and almost all of the fawns are gone, about 90% or even a little bit more than that. Dr. Monteith is going to talk a little bit more here in a minute about some comparisons from years past and some more specific data on the mortality that's been observed in the Wyoming range this year. We've also seen, and this is consistent with a lot of the areas where we've had this hard winter, we've seen increases in elk commingling with cattle, elk straying down into places where they don't normally go. And I'll talk in a minute about some emergency feeding that we've had to do over in the Green River region. What a lot of this means to all the areas I just described is significant cuts in hunting opportunity for those species that are affected, pronghorn and mule deer. And we're continuing now to monitor that. We haven't set the seasons for next year. And this is still ongoing. This situation is continuing today. And so we are continuing to monitor that right up until the point at which we go to our commission meeting and set seasons. And just so folks know, if we don't have all the information we need at that point in time, to be able to set a reasonable biological science-based hunting season, and we learn more later, we have the ability to make emergency changes after that April meeting. Green River had a more early onset of really hard winter. Probably early January, they started having a lot of elk damage. They had elk showing up in places that they've not seen them in a long, long time. Near Large Creek, there's 2 large emergency feeding operations. That we haven't done that there, and I don't know if we ever have. And then also one near Fontenelle Creek. The Bags country is maybe as bleak as I've seen as far as photos. There's a lot of places where you can't see a fence post there. And we've seen now that we're starting to have a little bit of melting, large concentrations of pronghorn that are dead around the bases of juniper trees. We do know that there's a little bit of a glimmer spot in Uintah County where the survival rate's actually been about 80% for adults, which for this kind of winter is not terrible bad. As far as the Star Valley goes, the winter came early there as well. They've had snow show up in October and it hasn't gone yet. A lot of below zero temperatures there. They are in Star Valley, they're emergency feeding in 6 different locations. I don't remember a year when we've ever emergency fed in 6 different locations. The snow load is very heavy. We've lost on some of our feed grounds. We've lost hay sheds that were overloaded and caved in. We've had elk show up and break down things that typically will keep elk out of haystacks. And we've actually even seen a little bit of elk mortality, which is not common because they're such a resilient animal. As far as Jackson, that's probably they've had a significant snow load, but because of elk feed grounds and a lot of deer and pronghorn that have migrated out of there, the mortality hasn't been anywhere near as significant as it has everywhere else. So with that, I'm gonna stop. We've got lots of information to answer questions. We've got the regional experts here. We've got representatives from all 3 of those regions: Green River, Pinedale, and Jackson. We've also got a disease expert, Brandon Skurlock. Many of you know him. He's from right here in Pinedale. And we've got our local commissioner, Commissioner Ken Roberts, is here as well today. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Monteith.
All right, thank you. All right, so what I'm going to relate to you is just simply hopefully leveraging the power of some of the information, what we've been able to learn from our work that's been occurring within this system since 2013. And of course, this isn't the first bad winter that we've seen. And so what we've been able to do is document essentially how these bad winters influence these animals, what it takes for them to survive, and then what we see on the other side of that. And so I'm just going to kind of go through some of that very briefly. Can you click on that slide? I think then. Okay. And so the deer population, it's a Wyoming range mule deer herd, which I think probably everybody in this room is very familiar with. We have the wintering segments of the herd, the Big Piney LaBarge area, and then the Kemmer Cokeville segment of the herd. And then these animals migrate up into the Salt River and Wyoming range with some of the most spectacular migrations that we're aware of. And of course, it's arguably or has been perhaps the largest mule deer population that exists in the world. Our work within this project, we work to follow individual animals over time for as long as we can. And more recently, we've been following since birth all the way to adulthood. The power of that is that we can follow animals that persist through winters like we're experiencing right now, and to see what it takes for them to get to the other side. Just to give you a sense of where we're at right now within these animals that we've been monitoring through these years and what we've seen in prior years. So you see our work began in the 2013-2014 winter. This is overwinter survival of adult females. And what you see is right at this very moment. And so all of these data are winter survival after we get all the way through the winter. We're not through the winter yet, of course, and we're at about the level of mortality that we've seen during the prior two bad winters. 16-17, probably most everybody remembers. 18-19 was actually quite bad on the southern end of our range. It was pretty mild on the northern winter range, so the Big Piney Labarge range, it was pretty mild, but it hit our southern animals, that Kemmerer Cokeville area, pretty hard, and that's what's reflecting that level of survival there. So we've lost about 30% of our adult females to date. With regards to, I lost it again for some reason. Can you go to the next slide? Maybe. Okay. With regards to juveniles, so these are our fawns that are entering into winter. So they're coming 6 months of age, or they haven't turned 1 year of age yet. In 16-17, we lost our entire cohort of radio marked fawns. 18-19 wasn't near as bad again because it was about half the range that was affected. Right now, we're dipping down to about 10% of our fawns that are still alive. I hope we don't lose them all, but we're basically going to be missing this entire cohort. Relative to adult males, we've only been monitoring adult males more recently. We saw a little dip in survival during the 18-19 winter. We didn't have a big sample, but we're certainly seeing that affect our adult males. In this winter, we dipped below 50%. What we've seen happen is as the winter has progressed, by the time we got into March, we had lost all of our males that were 8+ years of age. So essentially all of our older males we had lost by that period of time. I can talk more about that later if anybody's curious. Okay, so the point being here, what I'm going to talk about is essentially what we've learned from the 16-17 winter in particular, and then a bit from the 18-19 winter and how it's affected our animals and how they've persisted through it. This is a picture from the 16-17 winter, which, as many of you can attest, it doesn't look unlike some of what we see out in this country right now. Okay, skip a bunch of details. What I'm going to do is just highlight what we see with respect to factors that influence survival of animals through winter. This is a metric of movement on the bottom here. And so what we're seeing is that for animals that exhibit greater freedom of movement during the winter, we see a higher probability of survival. That freedom of movement is, you can just think about a landscape and its fluidity and their ability to move around it. It's also impacted by snow. Snow certainly affects their ability to move. The other thing we see is, this is intuitive, but it's great to be able to demonstrate straight up. When we see better, more robust shrubs that are also tied to better precipitation going into that year, so more leader growth on that sagebrush. We know a lot of these animals, over 80% of their diet is sagebrush, and it's those new leaders that are grown each year. So when they have more and better sagebrush, we see higher probability of survival. And this is associated with each animal's range where they occupy on that winter range. Not surprisingly, the more snow that they experience on their winter range, the higher probability of mortality that we see. So it causes a pretty big dip in survival. We see a slightly different influence with respect to age. Interestingly, older animals, yes, we see an effect of snow, but the reality is just because they're old, we're more likely to lose them. And that's this very striking relationship here. Our older animals, essentially, once we hit 10+ years of age, and especially if we get a legit winter, for adult females, we see a very low probability of them surviving the winter. Our younger animals certainly being more robust when it comes to that. But the primary driver as we enter into winter is, especially winters like that, like we're experiencing right now, that keeps animals in the game, is how fat they enter the winter. And so when we see animals entering winter with loads of fat, so up to say 20% body fat, it almost doesn't matter the winter and they can persist through it. Can certainly influence them. But those that start winter with low fat reserves, and so if you think about it, these are the fat reserves that they're bringing with them from summer range onto their winter range. If they don't have enough to keep them in the game, we're likely to lose them through the winter. So to sort of recap real briefly, what does it take for them to survive? More and better shrubs, less severe winter, obviously, move more with respect to what they experience. Our prime age animals were more likely to retain, and then in particular fat. So what does it take? And this fat, if you think about that, that's basically groceries that they're bringing with them from their summer range that they can then metabolize that fat and meet their energy demands through the winter. What does it take to make for a fat animal? If we can ideally get animals to start with 12+% body fat as we're going into winter, as we see from this relationship here, what we've learned through our work is that older animals just simply don't accrue the fat reserves. It's a process of aging. Prime age animals, we can certainly get better fat reserves. There's cost of reproduction, obviously, but the other thing that we see that influences them dramatically in their ability to gain fat is the food that they experience on summer range, so which is tied to the habitat quality and then the moisture that they experience on their summer range, and also the number of animals that are out there. So more animals on those ranges, less fat that they enter winter with. And there's I'm going to show you very quickly, we've seen this aspect borne out since we've experienced the 16-17 winter. And so these data simply represent average body fat of our animals on the north and south winter range since we began in March of 2013. We see these cyclic fluctuations as we go from end of winter to the fall. So as they go into winter, and we see these animals fluctuate up and down. But what I want to point out to you is that when we went into the 16-17 winter, our animals were at maybe 8% body fat, and our southern animals, when they went into the 18-19 winter, they were at roughly 8% body fat. They didn't have a lot of fat going into that winter. But look at what we've seen since we had the crash in the population that occurred during the 16-17 winter. We have much fewer mouths on the landscape. We see these incredible recoveries in body fat. In fact, we had never seen animals that fat until after the 16-17 winter. And what you note is we've generally maintained fairly fat animals since that period of time. And so what you'll note here is we started going into this winter with animals at nearly 12% body fat. That's a striking difference from our animals going into the 16-17 winter. And I think many of you will attest that this winter is certainly worse than the 16-17 winter. But I can only imagine if we'd have gone, which we'll be able to look once we get on the other side of this winter at what the consequences of that would have been. But I suspect we'd be probably going over 50% adult female mortality right now if we'd have entered this winter at that level. And so the realities of that is that winter, we've reaped the benefits of that winter in the reduction in densities on these ranges for these deer, because now we have deer that are much fatter and they were better prepared for this winter. And it's about all that's keeping them in the game right now. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and open it up for questions or comments from the audience. Like I said, we're gonna ask you to keep your comments to about 2 minutes, just so that we can get through everyone that has comments to offer. And if you would please state your name as well as where you're from, and this is particularly important for the folks who are joining us online. We'd really like to know where you're from. So we'll just and then the people online, if you do have comments, please go ahead and raise your hand, and our tech specialist will put you in a queue and let us know who's there first. So.
And Ivy, I just want to say there are people trying to get online. Apparently we're at capacity. We're trying to add some numbers. So anyway, just if you have friends that said I tried to get on, just understand there's a lot of interest. So.
Perfect. All right. So we'll go ahead and start with some couple of questions from here in the audience. So if you want to raise your hand.
I'm Tyler Wilson. Thanks for coming, Gordon, and talking to people in Sublette County. I've contacted your office a lot. I'm from Boulder, Wyoming, and lived there all my life. And I've watched the winters hard and not hard. And my question is, I've called Randall and talked to him and stuff. And I went to a game of fish meeting, and I talked to a biologist, and I was concerned with antelope and stuff. And he called my house phone and he says, "What do you think I should do about the situation, Tyler?" And I told him, and he says, "Well, we can't do that." I told him to plow these roads and kick some hay out and feed them like they did in the old days. And he wouldn't do it. But I want to know, everybody will need a chance to talk. I want to know why Pinedale Game and Fish took so long to bring it to your attention when they already knew the situation. And now they want to make a big deal of it. They should have been out there taking care of it because Idaho's fed their animals and deer and antelope since 1st of February. But I've talked to Randall, so I'll let you, somebody else have the mic.
Yeah, so hey, thank you for the question. And I'll start by talking about the first part of your question regarding feeding. And you know, we have looked at feeding not only here, but in other states. They have fed, they're feeding right now in Utah. We've looked at the results of and the outcomes of those efforts. And at the end of the day, they don't have an effect at a population level that makes us in any different spot when we get to the other side of the winter. Deer don't, you know, there are feeds that you can have made that will feed deer, but the scale at which you have to feed them and the point in time when you have to start feeding them, basically December, makes it so that you could go do all that and never have an effect at the end of the day. And so that's why we have chosen not to feed. They're doing it now in Utah. Their results are similar to what we've seen in the past in other states. I think they fed in Colorado a little bit this year. And again, not real positive results from that, from those efforts. You know, as far as our response, I can tell you that our folks have been out there on the ground. We have folks that haven't had time off since Christmas. They've been out on the ground every day, wading through dead animals, dealing with an ammonia outbreak, dealing with damage, dealing with concerned folks like you that want them to come look at a lot of dead animals, and that's what their time has been consumed with. Our folks have not failed to respond to this situation.
And Tyler, I just thank you very much for bringing that. You know, I've been aware of it for a while. We've been talking about it. The challenge, you know, Randall brought it to my attention when you first called. You know, one of the challenges you have whenever you feed is you get concentrations of livestock. You get concentrations of animals. We're concerned about brucellosis as much as we are about anything else. And you know, that's one of the things that we've been trying to figure out, how to make sure we keep the intermingling from happening. That's one piece. You know, the other piece is that you do have some diseases, some pathogens that are showing up. And anytime you concentrate, you know, wildlife around that, you know this pretty well because you grew up here. You know, you can get a lot of transmission of that disease. And so you can actually compound your problem to a degree. Now, I'm not a veterinarian. I'm just a rancher, kind of dirt farmer kind of guy. But that I've seen over my time, and I'm sure probably Dr. Moncrief can probably talk to that too. So, thanks.
Yeah, a couple of things real quick. The feeding is a tough situation. I will admit that. And it seems intuitive that would be a good thing to do. And even as we just talked about, I mean, the food, the sagebrush that animals have on their landscape and how good it is influences their probability of surviving in winter. So intuitively, that should be a solution. It's complicated in all sorts of different ways, from deer themselves or pronghorn, for example, relative to, I mean, their guts are way more complicated than ours are, as you all know. And in fact, they have microorganisms within their gut that digest their food for them, and they're essentially feeding them through that process. And so what we see as a winter progresses, especially in these conditions, that their whole rumen microflora have overturned and are changed to the way in which it's adapted to basically the coarse diet that they're feeding on at that point in time. And so the greatest risk, though there are feeds that are adjusted to compensate for that. In fact, when I was in South Dakota working there, we worked to design a feed that wasn't too hot as in too digestible for the animals, that would cause ruminant acidosis and bloat and all the complications associated with it. But it's tricky and it's hard. And in many instances, it may make us feel good, but it's sort of insidious because we're going to lose a lot of animals at the same time, just given basically the digestive upset, the acidosis, that of the potential consequences that are associated with that. The animals just can't process it because their gut's not ready for it. The other side of that, and we haven't actually talked about it basically since the 16-17 winter, relative to Wyoming range deer, and that is adenovirus. The leading cause of mortality of our fawns when we initially started that work in 2015 was adenovirus, which is astonishing. It's a hemorrhagic disease that honestly, it kills young fawns. It doesn't affect adults at all. But 30, 40 pound, otherwise healthy fawns just lay down and die. And it was known to be a Western disease, like California. It would crop up, they'd see die-offs, and then it would kind of go away. But at the time, it was like, holy crap, we've never seen this before. And it's not something we would see because fawns just lay down and die. They did make note of it in Star Valley, the biologist there. And it's generally associated with animal-animal contact and transmission in that way. Since the 16-17 winter, the reduction in density since that time, we've hardly seen it. It occasionally crops up. So the other risk from a disease perspective, when you increase animal-animal contact in that way, we would risk that disease popping back up again, which would be another great concern with regards to potentially feeding.
Yes. You have your hand raised.
Yes, on, can you hear me? Yeah, my name is Bill Ames, and I've got a question with regards to funding and what kind of a rainy day account the Game and Fish has for emergency years like this, where you have to do seeding, feeding, and future license sales. You know, I don't understand why we would harvest any doe fawn antelope this year, and how much pressure is there to sell licenses in a year like this?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And I will tell you that the information that will be used to determine any hunting season, the hunting seasons that we set this year, will not be based on revenue. And in fact, the primary impetus is going to be the science and what these folks here that are sitting here and their field people see out on the ground. This is not an issue of we don't have enough money to go buy feed. It's an issue of, you know, we have to be good stewards of your money, sportsman dollars. And we don't believe that if we go feed based on all the information we have, the information Dr. Monteith talked about, that we can really have an effect. You know, it's throwing away money. And these winners come, as we've seen, we have these kind of winners about every decade. And so this isn't a financial issue. We have the money to go buy feed if we needed to. This is more about doing what we think the science tells us is the right thing to do.
Take one more question from the audience here, and then we're going to go to the folks who are joining us online.
Governor, Director Paul Ulrich, Pinedale. Two quick issues. One, from a personal note, our family's been hunting in this area, in particular LaBarge Creek, for decades. We've never seen anything quite like this. I'm sure that's kind of the case for a lot of folks here. And based on that, you know, we've talked as a family and certainly would be very, very supportive of suspending or significantly curtailing deer and antelope licenses in that area. We believe something drastic needs to happen, given the fact that we've got some pretty drastic challenges out there. We're seeing it all over the county, and it's clearly devastating and upsetting for a lot of us. So for what it's worth, our family's talked about it, Governor, and you know, we love to hunt. That's what we do all fall. And for Wyoming's wildlife population, if it means us taking a year or two off, it's the right thing to do. Governor's second point, you know, from an industry perspective, most of you know I work for one of the large natural gas companies here. When appropriate, we are ready and willing to help any way we can. So, and thank you for being here, Governor, Director. Means a lot to us that you're here, really does. Thanks for the attention. Thanks, Paul. Online, do you want anything you want to say?
We'll go ahead and so Brian is keeping track here. Nobody has their hand raised there? Okay, so folks, if you're joining us online and you want to ask a question or offer a comment, please use your hand raise button, and then Brian will put you into the queue. If we don't have anybody online, we'll go ahead and keep asking with questions here in the audience.
Okay, Joy Ufford, Subblood Examiner in Pinedale Roundup. And while you were talking about forage, and I don't know who to address this to, but recently at the Game and Fish meeting, Mike Schmidt had mentioned breaking up the snow. And I'm wondering if that's a possible option to just break up the snow. Like, and that would also alleviate our winter ozone, but it break up the snow somehow so that wildlife could get down to sagebrush.
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Joy. So okay, I think there's two things there. One is that any effort to go out and like use a dozer out on, you know, these critical sagebrush grasslands that are in crucial winter range, there would be a large risk of damaging the habitat. And you know, sagebrush plants don't just regrow in 1 year and be healthy and productive after 1 year. You know, if you damage them, you got to wait a long time for those plants to be back viable and healthy and productive for deer food. The other thing is the scale, you know, the scale at which I don't know what that scale would be, but in order to break up snow or plow snow on enough ground to be able to make any kind of difference with, you know, in hundreds of thousands of acres that we have here, not only in Pinedale, but in all the other areas I talked about, you know, I don't think it's feasible. We did in Jackson at the National Elk Refuge, very small scale. They did actually attempt this on the elk feed ground in deep snow conditions to plow, to allow elk to move better across the feed ground. And what it ended up happening is that it melted and froze and created gigantic ice piles that made it even harder for the animals to move around. And it didn't prove to be effective. So that's what we know about it. We've never tried anything like that.
You know, and I would, I mean, again, not, this is just practical ranch experience, having run a dozer, having fed cows. You know, you will see the tracks of that dozer in sagebrush for years, decades to come. And if you start windrowing sagebrush, you start messing with habitat for sage-grouse and a whole bunch of other stuff. You know, it may feel like it's the right thing to do at the time, but the implications in a long term, I can show you tracks on our ranch where I ran, you know, down to get cows out of a place we had about 7 miles from home. And you can still see those tracks in the sagebrush, you know, 10 years later. And I'm not saying it's not worth trying something. I'm just saying that there are implications. It's not just a simple deal. So.
Okay. But 1 minute. Go ahead.
Thank you, people, for showing up, Governor. My name's Gary Garlick, and I'm from Big Piney. Couple of things. First thing I want to address, it's not a question, it's I grew up in Wyoming, for what it's worth, and I am disappointed with the Game and Fish's attitude anymore. They have a defensive attitude about programs and suggestions, it seems like. I come here and I've been around, and I would like to hear more solutions anymore. You look at journals from other states as far as feeding programs go. You don't see anything from Wyoming, essentially, as far as, even Governor, I worked at a coal mine for a lot of years, reclamation work. Well, you don't need to take a track dozer to get out in the sagebrush all the time. You can use a rubber tire or other instruments to scarify the ground a little bit and kick off some snow. You can actually improve the habitat in the wintertime. Fecal material, hoof action. I don't hear these things. And I want to start hearing from the Game and Fish about solutions. We look at the Pinedale Roundup and we find out what not to do, and we have for years. Don't feed the animals. You spend quite a bit of money as far as the elk go. They're the most durable animal of the ungulates that need the least attention, in my opinion. I sincerely, Randall, Luthi, for all your work in getting this in, Governor. My position is we need to start coming up with solutions, not catastrophe management. the Game and Fish needs a policy, even if we don't go out in the middle of the winter on mild winters. We need to, you people need to have a policy in place that's more visible for the community, for all of the people that utilize this resource that's better. Thank you for your time.
So thank you for your comment, Gary. I'll address a couple of points there. I'm not going to talk anymore about feeding. I think I've talked enough about that at this point, but you know, you're not going to hear me stand here and say that everything we do is perfect and that we got everything right. But I will tell you that the folks that we have that wear red shirts and drive green trucks in this state care about our wildlife resources, and the dedication that they have to that resource and to all of you is exemplary. I realize, you know, what I do, and that I have some biases. There's certainly that. Wyoming is regarded in a lot of other places as a leader. When you talk about one of the most important things we can do for critters on a winter like this is to allow them to be able to move around. And Wyoming is leading the nation in migration corridor policy. We have the only governor in the 50 states that has an executive order that describes how we are going to deal with migration corridors in our state. And that work continues on. We have the model for sage grouse core area management that is revered by the other states. The other states followed our lead on that. We have multiple opportunities because of the resources we have and because of the people we employ to do really cool things. We're open to listen to any other solutions. And believe me, when we hear something, even if it sounds like it's completely unfeasible, we do the work and we study to see if there's a way we can make it work. And when we can, we try to implement it. A lot of these things we've talked about here today, that just doesn't seem like it's a good use of resources because we can't make a difference. Wyoming big game animals have been surviving difficult winters before we were here for centuries. And it's ugly. Our people are, you know, saddened, just like all of you are. You have to go out and wade through. You know, I talked to one of our game wardens yesterday who went out on one pivot and had to look at 76 dead antelope. Those are the antelope that they invest their lives in trying to raise and trying to provide habitat and hunting opportunity for. And it doesn't make them go home at the end of the day with a very good feeling in their belly. So, but thank you for your comments. And believe me, we've got folks in here that heard that.
And Gary, I think what Dr. Moncrief said here just a moment ago is something to bear in mind, but I think your point is well taken. You know, if you change feed right now on these animals, it'll be really hard to them. Anybody that, you know, has fed cows in the winter and sees a big change in diet knows that you're going to have problems. But I think for future reference, it probably does make sense for us to look at what those particular types of feeds are, when we should begin to start thinking about that, where we're going to do it. Because, you know, I mean, you know as well as I do, we can't do it all over the country. We'll have to find the places to do it. And maybe that's something that the public should be part of that discussion. You know, and there's a cost, you know, to it. We got to know that. Hay in our country is $250 a ton right now. Most of this has been laid in, you know, before then. But right now, if you want to buy on the spot, it would be quite a bit more than that. So maybe there's some good thoughts on that.
Okay, we have.
I'll get back to you, sir. Thanks.
We have a couple of folks online that have their hands raised. And for those of you who are joining via Zoom, I would ask that you please keep your microphones muted until you're called on, just to make sure that we're not interrupting other speakers. So we're going to, I think it was Scott and Liz, but I can't quite see the last name. They had their hand up first. So go ahead, please.
Hi, this is Liz Bushelman. I live up LaBarge Creek. I was born down in Kemmer, and we are seeing some awful things in our area. We talk about feed. I have a question on habitat. We attended a habitat meeting. I asked if there was collaboration between the BLM and the Forest Service on how many pairs were allowed, because we have seen some habitat destroyed at elevations of 9,000 feet. And they said there's no collaboration. We talk about fat reserves that they're not getting. Could someone please answer me if that's possible to have this collaboration and what we can do to ensure that our wildlife have the chance to graze, that the cattle are off when they're supposed to be, and that there's not more pairs allowed than are permitted. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. This is Brian Nesvik, if you can't see me standing up here in front. So I'll take a quick crack at that. So we do have the opportunity to provide comments to both the BLM, the Forest Service, and any other federal land management agency. Obviously, those are the two largest ones that we deal with in this part of the world. And you know, their role and responsibility is to manage habitat. Our role and responsibility is to manage wildlife. And so we don't have any authority or regulatory ability with regards to how they choose to stock cattle or provide other uses. They're both multiple use agencies, but we do make sure that they understand what our concerns are from a wildlife perspective. We do, when we have concerns with the way that they implement management practices, we do have conversations with them. I would tell you that we have both at the local level and also at the state level and even at the federal level, we do have working relationships with both of those agencies. And the other thing I would say is that, the vast majority of our grazing allotments, particularly on forest in this part of the world, are managed well, and those that use them do it in a responsible manner. This country, before we were here, evolved with large ungulates, bison, grazing across this entire landscape. And in a lot of ways, domestic animals now are replicating the role that bison used to play on this landscape. So there's no doubt that at times there are some abuses, but I would say by and large, generally, that's not the case with our local livestock producers.
Okay, and we have one more person, it looks like, that has their hand raised online. Bill Winnie, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Bill Winnie. I'm from Bondurant area. And I'm wondering if you have linkages into other parts of Wyoming government that can assist that putting on that percent body fat, the packing on the pounds in the summertime, if you will, on that range, making sure that the migration routes are wide open. Maybe some things like animal overpasses. I know in talking with our fire chief, they've made a real difference on the people side of it, but maybe more of those would make a difference in getting those animals to the right places so they can pack on the pounds in the summertime. So is there other linkages outside of just the Wyoming Game and Fish and so on?
Yeah, so thank you, Bill. So thank you for providing strong support for one of our most important initiatives, and that's to construct very expensive, large-scale wildlife crossings. And the epicenter of where, one of the model examples of one of those crossings or two or three of those crossings is right here. I mean, you guys were leaders in this county for erecting the crossings that we have at Trappers Point just west of here. And you're right, they're effective. We saw, I can't tell you the exact number, but it was a significant decrease, 90% or more decrease in road mortalities when those things were constructed. The governor's made it a priority. We've made it a priority, and we have recently, I think the construction will be complete in October with the either 8 or 9 underpasses down at Dry Piney. Is it 9, John? Brandon? 9 underpasses, a very large scale project, $20+ million. We're now, we just completed one between Buffalo and KC on I-25, a similar type project without overpasses, but with using fencing in a strategic way to allow critters to move underneath the interstate. We've got a priority right now for a crossing project in Du Bois, and then also longer term a larger scale crossing project on I-80 to do an overpass over I-80. They're very expensive, and those are the big scale, kind of big picture priorities that we have leveraged between us and YDOT to kind of get to your question, Bill. Department of Transportation Director and I have sat down together and developed what those priorities will be. In addition to that, we had the Wyoming Roadways Initiative, the RIT team here several years ago, look statewide at where we had even smaller scale, large scale needs to allow animals to move across roads. They developed a large list. We think we whittled it down to about 40. But a lot of those smaller scale projects are being implemented all over the state. That they don't cost as much money, so they don't rise to like a statewide priority. But that's what we've been doing. I will tell you that I wish we were able to capacity wise do more. As an example, the I-80 overpass, if we were to start building that tomorrow, we know that the estimates are $30 to $40 million. I think that there's probably opportunities to look at different types of designs and scale it down and maybe not cost quite that much. But we are looking hard. We've got opportunities to apply for federal grants that came out of legislation that was passed just a little over a year ago. Many of you have heard about the infrastructure law. They put $350 million in that. The governor put $10 million into the trust in order to the Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resource Trust to be able to match those federal funds. That's required when we do that. And so there is some capacity to do the multi-million-dollar projects. And I appreciate you bringing this topic up because it is definitely something that's important.
I'd say
and Bill,
that Governor Gordon needs to keep those guys' feet to the fire.
yeah. Bill, I just going to say, and we, Bob Budd is here from the Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resource Trust. That's obviously an agency that works with it. We've been working very hard to get Wyoming Department of Transportation and the Game and Fish together. They've been doing great work. Beyond that, though, I want to, this goes back to the question Liz had asked. We've been in pretty regular contact with both at the DC level with both USDA and the Department of Interior to talk about better collaboration between both agencies. And then finally had a really good sit down with the Department of Transportation Director, Pete Buttigieg, and basically said, one of the big challenges that we have with these wildlife crossings is that at the federal level, you have to redesign every project that's already been designed on the ground. And how can we get through that network of bureaucracy in a more efficient, cost-effective way? What we're really, and I think Brian talked a little bit about this, what we want is effectiveness. It's nice to have a beautiful bridge, there's no question. And I'm sure people want to have their names on it. But what we really need is to have functional bridges that make sense for wildlife and a lot more of them. And that's what we're really focusing on. How can we make a more efficient program to get more of these up and doing more for wildlife? So to your question, Bill, we're focusing on the federal level and then right down through the state and trying to figure out how we get dollars on the ground better.
Good, keep on it, Governor.
If I might just add, sort of feed off of your comment, Bill, and thinking about, well, essentially how to make animals fatter and preparing them for that. I really appreciate that. Feeds off of Liz's question and Gary's as well. There's a lot of things. I mean, honestly, one of the best things we can do for animals as they're going into these winters is to prepare them for it. Not only with regards to the winter range, certainly, but also what they're bringing back from their summer range. And the reality is there's an extensive amount of collaboration between the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, BLM, Forest Service, and then leveraging what we've learned with regards to these animals, specifically in the Wyoming range. It's probably one of the model examples for some of the largest scale habitat treatment, restoration, conservation efforts that's probably occurred almost anywhere. Everything from winter range up on the summer ranges, from treating sagebrush to prescribed fires, recovery of aspen, those sorts of things. And then also working through conservation easements relative to recovery of tall forb communities up in some of the ranges. In some areas, you have some of the most robust summer ranges that exist that a mule deer could potentially benefit from. So the realities are in thinking in those ways. And as we've learned with our data, it's one of the best ways we can help enable animals to encounter and persist through winters like this is what they bring with them. And there's a lot of effort in that regard to be able to make those things possible. Certainly some things maybe could be worked on yet, but it's one of the best things we can do to get animals through winters like this, even though it feels like we want to do more while they're experiencing it, but it's preparing them for it.
Okay, we're gonna come back to in person, and we have a gentleman who's been waiting very patiently back here. So we're gonna start off with him.
Zane Straley from Pinedale. My brother and I got in a discussion last night on this cloud seeding. Who controls it? Does the state of Wyoming controls it, or does Nevada, Arizona, and California? How often are these monitors going off, and how many are there? And also, are you going to delay the antler hunting season? Thank you.
So I will get you, I'll thank you for that question. I'll get you data on specifics for what Wyoming does, but Idaho, Oregon, California, all these Western states do cloud seeding at this point. And we'll look at, where our sites are, and I'll get that information to you. So if you can make sure you leave your name here, I'll get that information back to you. But it is something we've been working on for some time. And one of the big problems, of course, and you all know it because you're in the upper part of the Colorado River Basin. Last year we were talking about the historic lows in Powell and Meade. And so, balancing all this is going to be a challenge. I'll let Brian take the other.
Whew. I'm glad he didn't make me answer the cloud seeding question. They didn't teach me anything about that in game warden school. So as far as the antler season goes, bottom line is we will evaluate that. And if the snow conditions and the location of animals are in a position where it's going to create an impact to wintering big game, and we need to change the opener for the antler season, it will receive serious consideration by our folks. I mean, we have the ability to do that. It's very problematic. There's a lot of nuances because I don't even know what the federal agency's abilities are to change their winter range closures in a responsive, quick manner. I don't have any idea. But we could do that. It would create certainly some challenges for the public who, in messaging and that kind of stuff. But if it's necessary, and we believe it's necessary to protect wintering big game because this winter is still here at that point, then we will seriously consider it.
Hello, Governor Gordon and Director Nesbitt. My name is Linda Baker. I'm representing over 200 supporters of the Upper Green River Alliance in Pinedale, Wyoming. Thank you for visiting Pinedale to discuss this alarming situation. Your last visit to Pinedale to speak about wildlife and the Migration Corridor Executive Order was February 1st, 2020, about 3 years ago. During those listening sessions, the Pinedale audience overwhelmingly supported designation of wildlife migration corridors in Sublette County. Close to $35 million mitigation dollars have been spent to help our herds for fence modifications, habitat treatments, and private land conservation easements. At Trappers Point, 2 overpasses and 6 underpasses were completed a decade ago at a cost of $10 million to help protect the 6,000-year-old migration corridor used by our pronghorn and mule deer. But for all this money spent, our Sublette pronghorn herd has been steadily declining. In 2007, the Sublette herd numbered about 62,000. In 2021, that number was about 40,000. There has been 50% mortality in adult pronghorn since December 1st, and this number will likely climb. It all comes down to habitat, maintaining and protecting quality habitat, and protecting pronghorn's ability to get to the food and shelter they need to survive. It comes down to protecting the migration corridors that connect landscape scale winter ranges and summer ranges throughout this valley. And that's the one thing, Governor, that this state has failed to do. It's all that's left to do to save our herds. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department has recently concluded a 3-year study on the Sublette pronghorn herd that fills in information gaps. The data from this and previous scientific research on Sublette pronghorn is now in the hands of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and is sufficient for a pronghorn migration corridor designation. The Upper Green River Alliance respectfully requests that the governor's office directs the Wyoming Game and Fish Department to use the scientific data available now to define and designate the path of the pronghorn in Sublette and Sweetwater counties. We also request that the Game and Fish communicate frequently with the BLM during their review of migration corridor habitats. The people of Wyoming have spoken. We support the designation of the path of the pronghorn migration corridor for the Sublette pronghorn herd. Our pronghorn cannot wait another minute. Please do it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And, you know, you're right. 2021 or 2020, which is the last time you had a meeting here on that migration corridor. We did have something that happened a little later in March that put things off for a while, but we did not slow down. And in fact, we're looking at 2 other corridors that are going to get going. The point I've made with this administration and the prior administration is we want something that's durable, that transcends administrations. And you all know, because you live in Sublette, that between different administrations in DC, there are very different land management policies on the ground. Pronghorn don't know the difference. They just need to have a durable way for them to have a migration path that makes sense. Drawing a line on a map is not going to fix that. Having people that are committed, that's private landowners, that's local agencies, that's the public, to seeing that migration corridor work. That's what's going to be durable for generations. And that's what we need to have. And we are continuing to work on this, and I do apologize. You know, a lot of things got sort of backed up. We lost 1/3 of our income. There was no production in Wyoming. And you have to admit that a large part of some of the funding that has gone towards these wildlife projects has come from the production that we've been able to get from the mineral resources here. And I'm very proud. In fact, you know, Wyoming, we have New Mexico that's saying, what are you doing up there for migration corridors? What are you doing on habitat? And we're not doing enough. I'll be the first to admit that. We've got more to do, and we'll continue to push it. And this is really ground zero for that. And that's super important. But drawing a line on a map and walking away from it and saying, look what we did. We've got all kinds of examples of that we're now fighting with. Yellowstone National Park. That line on a map, we know, is not as valuable now as what the habitat that comprises Yellowstone. I always wondered with the Yellowstone ecosystem, when was it you dropped out of the Yellowstone ecosystem? Draw me a line on the map where that Yellowstone ecosystem starts. We know because of these migrating animals that population migrates a lot further than anybody thinks is the Yellowstone ecosystem. So we've got to get people and private property owners to understand how valuable this is, which is one of the reasons we were able to sign a historic document with USDA, recognizing that private property owners, ranchers, provide habitat that is essential to wildlife populations, and they can be recognized for that. So I thank you for your comment. I thank you for your direct request, but I want you to understand we've got to have you in this discussion continuing going forward. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take one more question from the in-person audience, and then we're going to go back to the people online.
Yeah, thank you, Governor Brian and Dr. Moncrief. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come to Sublette County and field these questions. I'm Terry Pollard. I've been an outfitter here in Sublette County for 47 years and a local sportsman. You know, winters like this point out the importance, and thank God in the Game and Fish for our 22 state feed grounds, our state elk feed grounds. Without the elk feed grounds, I can see that we could be in a similar situation as we are with deer. You know, so we got to keep those elk feed grounds going. But in, you know, this present question with deer and antelope, I agree with the gentleman earlier that said, something to the effect that we need to cut, really significantly cut these seasons back, or the number of licenses. And I wouldn't be against seeing them shut down for a few years, totally. Just looking at the deer that we're seeing in our areas up around Burnt Lake and that country, we don't have any deer. I mean, they're basically gone. And another thing that I'd like you to consider, we brought this up, Brian, I know you have heard this many times. I think it's time that the resident come under a regional deer system as well as the non-resident. You know, it's time. It looks like to me that it's really tough for you guys to manage, you know, especially a year like this, try and manage an area on non-resident licenses are the only thing you can limit, or season length. You know, residents do use a little sense in coming to the areas when they know the deer populations are down, but still, and every resident in the state could come here, you know, and hunt next year. Nothing would stop them. So I really think it'd give you a better management tool to look at doing a regional deer. Antelope's already that way, you know, and I think it's time. I think it's time to do that deer. Thank you very much. Again, we really appreciate you coming out.
Yeah. Hey, Terry, good to see an old friend, and thank you for your comments. You know, the folks that are going to be influential in making those decisions are sitting here today, and we're able to hear you.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and take some comments from online. It looks like we lost Sarah. She'd had her hand up. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and Dan Bailey, please.
Hello, Governor Gordon. Thank you for this meeting today. Over the last 3 years in Sublette County, we've had 3 large developments take place. All of these 3 developments are in the corridor and the migration corridor for the mule deer. And the game and fish weighs in, but they often feel like they don't have much power to persuade the situation. And the county commissioners are given a great deal of latitude, and they just need to consider the regulations relative to the zoning application. The situation is that it's as though if you were speeding down the highway and you see the 70-mile-an-hour sign and you decide to go 100 miles an hour, and the police officer pulls you over and he says you're speeding, and says, well, I did consider going 70, but 100 is what I wanted to go. And I'm trying to make the point that I realize that we're talking about private property and private property rights where these developments are taking place, but this is an upzone of private property, taking away from agricultural property, which interfaces with federal and state property. Can we get some more support? Because the executive order does not address private property, but the upscaling and the upzoning of this private property is going to have an impact on the wildlife. And we're talking about a year-round problem for wildlife, not just a winter issue. I'd like to see if we could give Game and Fish more backing, and the county commissioners more backing to not upscale and remove private, to allow private development on a grand scale in these corridors. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your response.
Well, and thank you for that. And you know, it's a very good point that you make. And beyond that, I want to say that from time to time in this state, there is a pushback on having conservation easements. And Sublette County, it seems to me, has done a very good job of using conservation easements. That I think that is probably the best tool we have right now to safeguard against that. I know, I believe 10, 15 years ago, Pinedale was looking at trying to build infrastructure out away from migration corridors. That's not the way development went. So there, you know, that these are ongoing discussions. It's important. You know, to some degree, I'm happy to bring that in terms of trying to bring a little more persuasiveness to game and fish, but there are other parts of the state you'll appreciate that will not appreciate that at all. So it is a discussion that the legislature should have. But again, we need to protect the ability to have conservation easements because they are a very important tool.
But may I comment that we're going to see a lot of pressure. I'm from Bondurant. We're going to see a lot of pressure from Teton County and Jackson to continue pushing forward development in our county. So when a rancher has the opportunity to upscale his property by selling to a developer, and that developer has little regard for wanting to purchase a piece of property and then put it into a conservation easement, I just don't see that as being a workable solution. And we've had three large, a 32,000 square foot facility at the rim, 299 acre development at Pape Road and the highway, and a resort on the upper Hoback. All three of those will be detrimental to the wildlife in the corridor, and conservation easement, it's not going to slow down the guy that wants to make a lot of money.
Fair point.
Okay, so we have one more comment that we're going to take from online right now, and then we'll come back to in-person audience. And it looks like Sarah Elmhurst, if I am reading that correctly. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Sarah Elmquist Squires from the Lander Journal and Ranger newspapers. Not to beleaguer the feeding question, but we heard a lot about how that really doesn't work in the long term. And yet we do have some feeding stations. And I was wondering if someone could explain how that distinction is made. If it's maybe you start earlier in the season and that will work at the places that you've chosen. But how do you choose that, and how do you determine when it's going to be effective when it sounds like it's not overall?
So I think I got the gist of your question, and I'm going to just make sure I'm clear, Sarah. So you're asking, how would we know, let's just take this year out of it, if we were having similar conditions next year, how would we know when to start feeding if we were going to attempt to feed deer? Is that what your question is?
Yes, pretty much. Just wondering, why some seem to be successful that you're implementing here, when it sounds like the data suggests otherwise.
I understand now. I apologize. We talked about two different types of feeding. So we are doing emergency feeding for elk, and that's effective because elk can digest hay, and we can haul hay, and we can get it to them. And we're doing that almost exclusively to deal with elk that are creating disease transmission risks with domestic cattle, number one. Number two, elk that are creating damage to private property, to haystacks. And those are effective because we can haul it in, and deer can digest it, and deer can be healthy on fed hay. Deer are a completely different story. We have not engaged in feeding elk, emergency feeding elk, to increase their survivability. It's been more to deal with and mitigate damage and conflict between elk and domestic livestock.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and come back here in person.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it. My name is Lori. I'm from Pinedale. This question is not directly related, but it is to a degree. You talked about the microbiome of the pronghorn antelope and how important the summer feeding is to go into the winter. And then you mentioned treating the sage, and then someone else had mentioned here this evening about the cloud seeding. And I'm wondering, since the microbiome is 80% of a person's immune system and possibly much higher in the pronghorn, how does that affect what's going on with the pronghorn as far as the pneumonia as well?
That's a really good question. The reality is M. bovis is that pneumonia is something that we know very little about still. It's cropped up in a couple of places. Over by Gillette is where we knew it to occur a few years ago. And then it's popped up here. At least at the moment, I mean, some of the things that we're beginning to understand better because we've been working on similar things longer, pneumonia related issues in bighorn sheep. Once new contact with pneumonia comes into a situation, oftentimes it can potentially wipe out a bunch of animals, but then sometimes there's some resistance that's developed to it. Animals may carry it, but they can persist through it. And then when you get severe conditions, maybe rises in density, maybe combined with bad winter, stressful situations, compromised immune system, and animals able to tolerate it, its ability to tolerate it is compromised, and then it affects them further. The reality is with M. bovis, there's so many unknowns yet. It's fairly new to us, so to speak. And so it's unclear relative to what that may mean yet, whether animals were carrying it and then these conditions were the overload, compromised immune function, and then we're seeing the losses associated with it, or if it's new contact within these situations as animals are moving around in maybe different ways than they had in the past, given the conditions and what they're attempting to flee from. So there's a lot of unknowns associated with it, but we are beginning to appreciate more and more this sort of interface between an animal's condition, the environment it experiences, and then the pathogens or bacteria that it's attempting to tolerate or contend with at the same time. But a lot of unknowns yet.
Brandon, you got anything to add to that?
I just say the silver lining, if there is any, at all these pronghorn mortalities is that we are developing, our labs developing a assay where they can test blood and see if pronghorn or bank blood samples to see if pronghorn have been exposed to this before. And then we can also test for it in the future. So we're using these known positives to basically develop a blood test for mycoplasma.
Hi, Jasmine Allison with Pure West. We're a large operator on the Pinedale anticline, and we're very concerned about the wildlife loss. And we're here to help and offer our support. And maybe that operator perspective, what we're working on are any changes that we need to make. So our wildlife friendly fence change out is significant. We're aggressively tackling that. Our reclamation work that we're doing, we have a lot of habitat that we cover, and we work extensively on that with all the agencies. I'd like to give a big thank you to our local Game and Fish. They have really worked with us and have kept in constant communication with what we need to do and have really supported us, and we hope to support them too. We're also actively working on any cleanup that we can help with as things change through the season, so we don't have, any further mycoplasma bovis, as well as just the landscape itself. We don't create a secondary problem. So thanks. Just comments.
Don't say nothing. You ain't gonna say nothing, are you? No, wait.
Thank you. And Logan Hedges here from Star Valley. Good to see Mr. Nesbeck. I've been coming to a lot of these meetings for a long time, not just Wyoming, several other states. And I debated coming over to this one, to be honest with you, because we're all a little frustrated, and it doesn't do any of us really any good to get frustrated and get mad at anybody. I've talked to almost every one of your biologists over the last 6 weeks, and you got some great people that work for you. So I will commend them and all your field agents that I've dealt with over the years. They're great people, and they are trying to do what they believe is best. I may not agree with them all the time, but I do believe that they're doing a really good job. So I guess my biggest deal is I've got a whole notebook here, but I'll just make it quick. I'll go with
the Wyoming range deer herd. I mean, it's near and dear to my heart over there. Boy, it's looking rough. It's been looking rough for a while. 2011, we had a bad winter. We had a bunch of meetings about it. Nothing came of it. 2017, it hit us again. You know, we had a few good years there. Things bounced back a little bit. 2017, here it came again. Everybody look out that window. That's what it did then too. And, you know, hammered us again. Lost a bunch of our deer. They have not recovered, regardless of what anybody says. They did not recover from that winter very well and stuff. You guys counted them. We were just under 30,000 deer, right? And when we counted this December or something, you guys counted. I talked to Frey the other day over there. We're going to drop below 20,000 deer on that Wyoming range, the lowest we've ever had on a deer herd that used to be over 70, 80,000 deer. Our objective is 40,000, and we've lowered that bar over the years. So that to me is scary as much as anything. It's frustrating. It's hard for me to look at this kid and explain that to him. A kid that loves to hunt. I would love him to have the opportunities that I had growing up, and they're just not there. So I guess to me is, what are we going to do about it? I mean, we can't do anything about that out there, unfortunately, but we need to start controlling the controllables. And now we've had these conversations. I've talked with all these guys about it, from predators to tag numbers. I mean, there's tons of things out there, elk numbers. We need to figure out how we can help these deer over the years and still give everybody opportunity. I mean, I want to go hunt these deer. I haven't killed a deer in Wyoming for probably 8-9 years. I don't need to kill one, but I still like to go out there, and I'd sure like to go out with him. So, I mean, that's my question to you guys is, what can we do, and what can, as a community here, what can we do to help out? We're probably willing. I think most people here are willing to sacrifice a little bit. So if we would do something like that, I think it's going to help in the long run, or I hope it's going to help in the long run. Appreciate you guys.
Well, thank you for your comments, and I appreciate you recognizing the efforts of our folks, because I wholeheartedly agree with you. So, you know what? There is no silver bullet, because we're as frustrated as a lot of the folks in this room are. We would love to be able to have the Wyoming range mule deer and all the other mule deer herd units in the state at or above their objective. But the fact is, we haven't found the silver bullet, the way to make that happen. This doesn't help. It's out of our control. Got that. But the things that we know we can do and that we have been investing in is a lot of this habitat work, learning. Dr. Monteith has helped us to learn a lot more about all the ecology around these deer herds. You know, you can mess with hunting seasons and have a short-term effect, but for the long term, you know, hunting seasons aren't the answer. We're killing hardly any female deer, and bucks don't have fawns. So, you know, it's all about, at the end of the day, how we make females be productive and have lots of fawns. And the way to do that's habitat, movement, having the ability to move across the landscape. You're right. There's opportunities to address the other side of the predator-prey equation with predators. We have increased quotas in certain places. I can't tell you what they are over here. I don't know, but I know that we've addressed it in places where we think it's prudent, responsible, and appropriate. You know, the other thing too that I think is interesting to note here is this: other states are dealing with the same exact thing, and they're very troubled. They're having the same town hall meetings that we are here. They're frustrated because this decline, if you look across all the states that have mule deer, is very similar. And in fact, the Wyoming range is one of the most resilient deer herds in the West. It's done better than a lot of what the other herds in the other Western states have done. So my point there is that we're not the only ones trying to find this solution. Everybody's looking at it. I mean, almost all of his work, this man's work, and he has a shop of several folks, is focused on mule deer. And so all I can say is we're trying. I agree with you that we haven't found all the solutions. I know that there's times we disagree on what they may or may not be. But I can tell you this, that if we don't have the conversation and we don't hear from folks like you, we're missing a big opportunity. And so we need you to continue to not get frustrated and still come to the table.
That we can't look around and say, hey, you know what, these guys got it figured out. This part of what they're doing is figured out. Whether it's from Utah, Colorado, I mean, I know we don't like them. We're pretty proud here in Wyoming and stuff. We kind of look down on them, but justifiably so. Because I hunt those states all the time and I deal with all those agencies for my job. But we can't be so proud that we can't take a little bit from here and a little bit from here to make this better. Because this is the greatest mule deer herd in the world, or was at one time. But if we're dropped to below 20,000 deer, and we still got over five, I mean, your numbers are gonna show we're still gonna have 5,000 hunters out on that, hunting those deer. I mean, that's basically, we kill 30% again, or 33% again, we're taking half our bucks out of it. So, I mean, that's just, I'm a numbers guy, and I've run all these numbers, I got all my deer, if anybody wants to look at them. And I've tried to figure it out, and it just doesn't pencil out. And that's, I wish it did, but I can't get it penciled out. But I do appreciate you guys doing it.
Well, thank you for your comment. And I will tell you that we're not too prideful to look at other states, but we don't always agree with what they're, with what they do. So.
Okay, so we've got about 6 minutes left here. I don't see any hands raised online. So this is going to be your last chance if you're online and you have a question. Again, if you haven't been called on, we ask that you please keep your microphone muted if you're online. It really is disruptive for the people. It comes over the speaker here in the room, and so it's quite disruptive. So with that, we'll have time for a couple more questions here.
Okay. Joy Efford with the newspaper. I've been waiting to hear something about the sublet mule deer herd in corridor. And ongoing efforts to build that back up. It triggered the matrix this past year, and the numbers aren't going up there either. And I'm wondering, I know habitat work is important, but I'd like to know what the state, if there's anything the governor can do to help this migration corridor and herd, or that the game and fish can do like more immediately, because I don't see that many sublet mule deer myself. And we won't hunt mule deer anymore in the Hoback Basin either. So.
Joy, I don't know the details real well. So I'm going to ask John to help me here. I don't know about the trigger, and I don't know the details.
I think I understand your question, but basically what can we do for sublet deer? We've been talking mostly Wyoming range deer. Is that your concern question? Right. In the response, it's similar. I mean, the best thing we can work on now and in the future is habitat, continuing doing that, continuing working on corridors and things like that. We have done a ton of work, habitat work within the sublet herd, thousands of acres. I think we've been getting more and more support with private landowners, with all the contributing agencies, and collaboration to work together on those projects. And I see that continuing. I don't know how many acres of work we've done. I had that stat memorized for about 10 minutes and then I forgot. But just one example too is things, and it seems small, but things like fence conversions. That's been ongoing. We've been doing quite a bit of that over the last 5 years. Troy Fiesler, our habitat biologist, just gave us some pretty impressive stats that we've converted with the help of landowners, other agencies, and so on. We've converted over 500 miles of fences to wildlife friendly specs. And you may not think a fence would be that big a deal, but when you're a migrating animal that's going, those huge distances, or when you're an animal right now that's every step that it takes costs a heck of a lot of energy. A fence like that is absolutely huge. Things like that are ongoing and will continue. I know I'm not sure I'm understanding your question if I'm not answering.
sublet mule deer, given its decline and the trigger and everything else. I understand habitat and fences, but they are working yet. We hit the trigger with the PAPO record of decision.
Right. And again, it comes back to continuing as much as we can on that habitat or highway crossings, all of those different options.
Take a shot.
Okay, we have one more and then we'll turn it back to the governor and director for closing comments.
Just along the lines of the wildlife friendly fencing and the current issue with the deer getting across fences and roads, is there any problem that you guys have seen with respect to the way the roads are plowed and creating large berms along the fencing?
I'll take a quick crack at it. I just looked at my local folks over here and I got a lot of this. So I don't think we've observed any challenges or barriers. You know, the bigger barriers have been with when the snow conditions are like this, wildlife are trying to find the path of least resistance. So it's railroad tracks, roads, anywhere where there's a pinch point, you know, that where they can get hit by vehicles or trains is where those are the real problems.
So sum it up.
Sure. I would just one comment for everyone here. If you have a question that you didn't get an opportunity to ask today, I am Mr. Luthi would be happy to take your question and get answers back to you. So again, please feel free to grab him and share your question with him and he'll get back to you. With that, we'll go ahead and Mr. Governor.
Okay, well, thanks. And I'll just make a couple of comments and then turn it over to Brian. You know, first off, thanks for the conversation. Thanks for the candor. It's important. You know, we all know this is a very devastating winter. It's the worst we've seen in gosh, I think, you know, we go back temperature wise 30 years. Most of us were probably kids when we had this kind of a winter. But in terms of the question you asked, Joy, you know, Bob, I don't know if you off the top of your head know how much money we've put into with sublet and Wildlife Natural Resource Trust. I know in our country, we're doing a lot of mahogany work, trying to figure out mule deer habitat and make sure we don't get the encroachment from jack pine and things like that. So do you have an idea what that is?
Governor, thank you. I'm Bob Budd. I'm the director of the Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Program. We've got over $20 million invested in Sublet County on our end from the state, and it ranges from every type of thing that's been discussed here today. We've helped to fund Dr. Monteith's research from the day one. We've helped to fund all of the underpass, the highway crossings, Dry Piney. We've done a ton of the habitat work on the Wyoming range and on the Wind River front. And the good news is for every dollar that the state spends, we're generating $5 to $7 in external funds. So for that 20 million is about $100 million that's been spent in this county to address the very issues that you're talking about. The big thing that Brian talked about earlier is scale. We still have scale in Sublet County, and it's near and dear to my heart. But when you have scale, you have a lot of cost. And you have to look at what are the things you can do. And some of those are things that people just don't particularly like. Conservation easements are a big part of that. Fire is a big part of that. There are all kinds of disturbances out there on the landscape that are part of that. And we just have to get better and smarter. But this county, the two counties in the state that have taken the bulk of the funding since day one in 2005 are Sublet and Carbon. And that's two of the counties we're dealing with right now in this winter.
And thanks for that. So, you know, one of the things is direct dollars, but today I think we heard, you know, more push on migration corridors. We obviously need to do more. And we are ginning up. I'm pretty excited working with, you know, in the northern part of the state, trying to figure out if there's something we can do in the park area clear out into the, we know we have migration from the parks out into the basin area. So we, things we can work on there. But obviously more needs to be done on the ground. I think we have great cooperators here in ag, in energy, and others who really want to ideas about snow breakup. And, you're right. We can use we don't have to use tracked vehicles. You can use rubber tires, but if you blade something, you're still going to do something. But maybe there's a way to think about that. But we also need to understand what the implications are for predators. And on that note, to the question of what we're doing, we put more money into predator control. We're making sure that we're trying to do the best job that we can to keep our predators under control. And that includes going after the grizzly. We've worked to delist the grizzly. We need to do that. It's been delisted twice before. We've been shot down in court. We will continue to do that. And the point that I make over and over and over again to Fish and Wildlife Service, when I was a kid, and I've got home movies of folks with bears in the back of their, of their convertible, and the gal's climbing over her husband and getting away from the bear. But that's the way it used to be in Yellowstone Park when they fed at the dumps. And then some of you may remember when we closed the dumps, there was suddenly Steve Mealy and others were saying, oh my God, the bears are going to die. Well, Steve didn't say that, but others had said, we're going to take away their food source. They're all going to die. They didn't, they adapted. And now they're adapting again. We had bear 399 all the way down almost to Alpine last year. And people need to understand wildlife do adapt and they change. And when there's a predator, we've got to understand that it does change and it needs to be managed. I think we talked a little bit about what development can be and how zoning can be impacted. You all understand the private property rights and what zoning does. Part of what we're trying to do, this administration, my administration is trying to do, is to try to find other ways that we can keep ranchers ranching. Because frankly, you can make a lot more money if you sell it to big high dollar houses, and you live in a beautiful county where people are going to want to pay a lot. But I think we also have these traditional roots in agriculture. I know I have them. I don't want to see my place broken up. But it is hard to keep a ranch going. It's hard to have kids that come back. We need to figure out ways to make that happen. We need better tools to bring more revenue to our ranchers. But we did talk a little bit about private property and what the partnerships can do. Talked about licenses, what happens there. A lot of things came back down to what we have to do about habitat, and good ideas came here. On that note, I guess we talked about mahogany, and Bob talked a little bit about the money that we put in here. We talked about not being too proud, learning from other states and what they've done. And then one thing we did not talk about that I think is really important, and it's critical, and it's affecting our wildlife populations across the state. We have an invasive species outbreak, everything from cheatgrass to ventonata to you name it. All of this stuff is coming in and it's affecting the wildlife. And we've got to control that. And that's a challenge. And we've put dollars into that as well. But some of that comes back down to people doing things like making sure they don't drive through cheatgrass and then drive out in the middle of a pasture. We've all got to take some care on that. Now, if there's some things we've missed, I want to hear about them. And I just really appreciate the conversation we've had today. And I thank you very much for being here. And with that, Brian.
Excellent summary, Governor. The only thing I wanted to end with is just to end on, what's really a gloomy topic and has a lot of folks in this room very concerned, has our department very concerned, and our state very concerned. There is some goodness that's going to come. And when we look across this landscape in this part of the world in May and June, it's going to look glorious. I mean, this moisture does bring goodness, and a lot of the plants that antelope and deer rely on do really well with snow melt in April and do really well with early spring moisture. And so there will be high productivity, at least to start the summer off. I hope it continues to go. Our streams and rivers are going to be in really good shape. And, compare and contrast that to last August, when it was not the case. So there is some brightness on the horizon. I really appreciate everyone's patience. And again, I thank everyone for taking some time to come out and show how much you care about our state's wildlife. Thank you.